So hello everybody, this is Scott Poynton and it's another TFT Earthworm podcast, and I have a very special guest with me today who I've spent the last 2 days with, and it's Barbara Reid. Hello Barbara.
Hi there Scott. Hi.
Barbara has come here to Switzerland and has participated, or has led in fact, facilitated a wonderful event with the TFT Swiss office, and we've had a colleague come over from the UK, and it's called the Circle of Trust. And the Circle of Trust is a concept, an idea developed by Parker Palmer in the US from the Centre of Courage and Renewal. And Barbara is the only trained facilitator of the Circle of Trust process here in Europe. And she's come over from the UK, spent a couple of days with us. So Barbara, without telling any of the secrets, because they are confidential events and we've all gone through it, we're all feeling terrific actually after the 2 days. Can you tell us a bit about the Circle of Trust and the ideas behind the method and what we've been trying to achieve here the last 2 days?
Thanks, Scott. So circles of trust are places where it's possible for us to come together and to reflect on where we are in our work, but also in our life generally, and to touch in on themes such as authenticity, integrity, what it means to be whole in our working life. So themes that are connected with vocation, how we do our work, and how we kind of fit our work in with what we sometimes consider to be our separate private life. So we invite people to come together and reflect together following a fairly kind of structured approach using metaphor. And the metaphors that we use enable us to hear that inner voice, the voice that we may have heard initially when we were drawn into the work that called us. But sometimes if we've been doing that work for a very long time, it can become difficult to hear.
We can lose it along the way.
Yeah, we can lose it. And in particular, if we're working in kind of what I would call frontline work, so campaigning work, public services work, Parker Palmer refers to the experience of being in this kind of work as working in the tragic gap, and the tragic gap being the gap between how we know things can be and how things are at the moment. And we need people to be able to hold tension in these gaps. But at the same time, it's an incredibly exhausting and tiring place to stand. And so the idea of these circles, he came up with this idea of these circles as providing places for where people could renew. And in that renewal, maintain that sense of courage that was needed to stand in the tragic gap.
It's been a great experience for us. As I said, we've just concluded and people have gone off, but I think they've gone off with a greater sense of purpose, a renewed sense of purpose perhaps. One of the phrases that we hear about the Circle of Trust is the link of soul and role, and I think the realignment, if you like, of soul and role. Can you just share with us some of the techniques that we've been through today? And well, you mentioned about the metaphors. We've had so many wonderful poems shared with us, and people will know that in TFT, poems are very important to us. We share them with people in our work. Just if you can just share with us the ideas behind the technique and how you're helping people reconnect with that inner voice.
So the word soul, of course, is a big word, and it can mean very different things for different people. So a nice simple way of understanding this is about reconnecting who we are with what we do, who we really are with what we do. And we use poetry, and we've been using poetry here in this Circle of Trust. We collectively call these items that we use third things. So we've used some video as well in this circle. And the idea of a third thing is a kind of replacement for the teacher. So Parker Palmer, when he designed this method, he had a kind of healthy suspicion of gurus, and he was a Quaker by background. And so very influenced by the model of collective leadership that can come when we sit down and hold space for each other. And so the idea of a third thing is that I like to say a poem is an inanimate object, but it's not really an inanimate object.
It can be very rich.
Can be extremely rich.
Full of life.
Full of life. And of course, you hear the poet's voice. So sometimes the poet becomes the facilitator, actually, in the group. But the point of a third thing is that we reflect around the third thing. And in reflecting around the third thing, we're not speaking to a figure in the room who's the teacher. We're reflecting for ourselves around this third thing. So it really is learning without a teacher, except that the real teacher is our inner teacher. Because what we're encouraging ourselves to do is listen to our own voice, listen to the voice of the soul, that voice that we may have lost or that may have gone quiet on us.
We had a wonderful and intense, I think, experience this morning with the clearness triads. We all broke up into groups of 3, and we'd had some nice training yesterday on the art of open questions, and off we went into our groups. A very powerful experience where we each addressed a dilemma that we were facing. Just share us a little bit about the idea behind the clearness triads.
So in this retreat, we used an adapted form of clearness committees. And the intention was for us to give an opportunity for everybody to experience this way of working with open, honest questions. So we've worked in clearness triads. So Parker's idea for clearness committees, he jokes that it comes from the 60s. And then he says, but it was the 1660s, because it goes right back to the model of Quakers sitting together at a time when they had no minister or no religious leader. So as a marginalised group, they simply didn't have people who could lead them. And so they learned this way of supporting each other quietly, sitting in quietness, in silence, until something that needed to be spoken was spoken. And so really Parker borrowed from these traditions to create a secular way of holding space. And in the triads, what we're doing is we're structuring that in a very particular way to allow an individual some time, in this case half an hour, to reflect on a dilemma or a problem or a decision that's around for them, and to do so around a few open, honest questions that are offered by the 2 other participants in the triad. And we did some preparation for that throughout the first day, thinking about how we listen, thinking about how we begin to ask questions, and then some very specific guidance on how we can keep our questions nice and open, how we can stay out of the way of the focused person's reflection and allow them to do the work they need to do and trust that they know how to do it without our interference or without our so-called help.
Our efforts to answer the question for them.
Yes, indeed. So sometimes in normal conversation, if you think about conversations with friends, they come along and tell you that something's happened in their life and it will ring a bell with you. And then before you know it, you're in their conversation telling them what you did, and suddenly it's not about them anymore. So the space for their beginning to reflect on, make sense of what's happened to them, suddenly gets taken up with your dilemma as well. So in a clearness triad, we're very deliberately setting up a kind of code of conduct, if you like, for the purposes of the exercise, where people stand back from that and really witness. I mean, it's a kind of witnessing that goes on. So they're witnessing with the focused person and then offering as a gift questions that may assist the focused person to take their reflection further or widen it out or mirror back things that have been said that allow the focused person again to perhaps adopt or perhaps find a particular way of working with what's presented for them.
Well, I found it very powerful myself, and really, I think one of our colleagues mentioned, 30 minutes focusing with the help of 2 great colleagues on a problem. It's amazing how far you can get with it. So it was very powerful, and I'm interested. You've come over here from the UK. You're the only Centre for Courage and Renewal facilitator here in Europe. I imagine you're very busy. Who else are you working with, and how are you finding it going? Are you finding that outside of the US, where the centre is very busy and active, are you finding there's resonance here in Europe? Are people really looking for this sort of experience?
I think that's a really good question, actually. So at the very beginning, after I'd finished my training as a facilitator in the US, and that was a bit of a journey in itself because there was nervousness about taking the work outside of the US. And the nervousness was simply, I think, that the centre didn't have a lot of experience of operating outside of the US. And so because there's a lot of discussion about integrity in this work, they wanted to know that they had somebody that they could have confidence in. But in the beginning of bringing this work here, I suppose the first thing is Parker Palmer is not so well known outside of America. I mean, he's a well-known educationalist, social activist. He's been campaigning for most of his adult life. Not so well known here, other than a particular book that many people have heard of, called The Courage to Teach, which is known about by teachers. And actually that was the first book that I came across as well. I was a university teacher, experiencing all of the usual pressures and contradictions of university life. I worked in vocational education, which means a lot of hours of teaching, and also working with students who are coming not from school, often a bit older, with work experience, and was, really committed to the work, but also worn out with the work. And when I found the book, I found myself wishing that I'd had it 10 years before.
It really resonated with you.
It completely resonated with me, and that introduced me to the other books, and then gradually into the facilitator training, and then bringing the work over here. So there's a different approach, I think, over here. Firstly, there's, a bit of work to explain to people, what this work is about. And you've just been through the couple of days, and it's difficult to explain in plain, ordinary words what this experience is like.
It's completely different from anything we've done before. We've had retreats with our staff, but this is different, and it's challenging, in fact. It's not easy. And you don't just turn up and go through a few exercises and rah-rah. You actually have to work very hard. It was challenging, but certainly worthwhile.
Yes, so we've had a Courage to Lead retreat, and we would characterise the work as inner work, reflection, contemplation, a lot of journaling we've done, private journaling, and then some, quite gentle sharing in pairs and triads. But this inner work that's often regarded by people as kind of soft work is actually quite gritty.
And exhausting. Well, I think everyone's gone home feeling pretty tired, actually.
Yes, I think it is tiring, and I think sometimes when we maybe have not spent time listening to what really calls us, when we start favouring that voice and allowing it to be heard, as we've been doing here, there can be a poignancy in that. It's a bit like eating chocolate, when you're 40, having never had chocolate before.
It's a wow experience, right?
Assuming you like chocolate, of course. So you have this chocolate, and you there's this regret for maybe all of the time that you hadn't known chocolate. And I think something similar can happen for us when we start hearing this voice and start realising that our values can speak to us in this way and be a plumb line for our work.
And how many years have you've been doing it now, Barbara? And have you had those eureka moments with people? Have you just seen people light up and you can almost feel that release in them? Have you seen this happen?
Yeah, so I've been associated with the centre now for 5 years, leading circles for 3 years. Yeah, I have seen people light up. I mean, for myself, the very first circle that I went on as a participant, having read all these books, was in San Francisco, and at the moment when I was called to introduce myself, to say who I was and where I come from, there was an earth tremor.
There you go, it was a sign, often sent.
Well, it was noticeable. And then that was followed by another retreat that I did in Arizona, and it snowed.
So how could they not have faith that you were the right for the first person to facilitate in Europe? How could they not believe?
Well, I don't know. And then the third one, I met Jesse Jackson.
Wow.
So, it's been a very unusual experience, really. And apart from these rather visible symbols of there being something at work here, I do this work because it allows me to be myself. It allows me to show up wholly as myself. And I think back to my kind of teaching life in university, where I had all of my little compartments for all of my different bits of work. So I had my research time, I had my time teaching, I had my administration time, I had my commuting time to and from work, I had my time writing papers at home, I had all of my little compartments of work, and somewhere in there myself got squeezed out. And it took me a long time, I think, to realise, partly through doing this work, that I was the one who was squeezing myself out, and actually I wasn't serving anybody by squeezing myself out. So it's okay for me to show up with my work now, completely as I am, even if that means some days that, I'm having a bad day, or...
we all have them, right?
Yeah, we all have them. And there's an honesty in this work There's a kind of authenticity in the sense that I can be really real now.
And you can help others do the same. So I'm Scott Poynton, and this is the TFT Earthworm podcast, and I'm talking with Barbara Reid, who is Europe's only facilitator for the Centre of Courage and Renewal based in Seattle in the US, and we've just been through this terrific retreat here. We just talked about you a little bit, Barbara. Tell us a bit more about your background. I know that you've been a university lecturer, you're a PhD. I know you do other interesting things, some of it in the mindfulness space you were talking about before, but another interesting thing I learned about you is that you've recently become a Buddhist nun. Tell me about that experience.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. About the same time that I discovered Parker Palmer's books, I also began meditating. And, you know, as you do when you have a bad time, people come and say, you want to try this. And somebody suggested to me I start meditating. He did happen to be a former Buddhist monk, so I kind of thought, yeah, he's probably right. And so I began learning to meditate. There is a Thai Buddhist monastery within a couple of hours from where I live, and I took some retreats there. You know, you spend some time practicing and then some more time practicing, and then one day somebody says to you, are you a Buddhist? And I sort of thought, well, yeah, probably I am.
I hadn't thought of it before in those terms.
Not really, not at all, no. And then an opportunity arose through one of my teachers who was a Buddhist monk, a British person, had trained in a Sri Lankan monastery, and he was working actually with a Swiss nun who was based in Burma, to bring her over to offer temporary ordination in the Burmese tradition for people who were long-term meditation practitioners in this particular tradition, which is the Theravadan tradition. And I thought at first, oh, that was probably not for me. That was probably for far more serious people than me. And he encouraged me nonetheless to consider it. And so I did. And so there were 6 of us, and we ordained together in a retreat centre in Ireland. The nun who was, so the word is preceptor for the person who kind of holds the ceremony. The nun is a wonderful nun, Arianyani, who comes from Zurich, actually. She's a local lass.
How amazing.
And it's a very interesting process. So it involves shaving your head and putting on robes, and we lived as nuns for a couple of weeks. And then, of course, you leave. But, of course, the thing about leaving is very interesting because there's a coming out involved, because you are going back into your life with a shaved head. And as a woman, of course, for most women, that has a very particular connotation. And so you have to explain why you have a shaved head. So it was an interesting experience for me being there during the ordination retreat, but it was even more interesting for me leaving the retreat and I guess having to go public, if you like, on my Buddhism.
How did your friends react? Were there, oh, that's crazy reactions, or I imagine there's a lot of intrigue? How did people cope with it in a way?
Yes. So at work, I was still working in university at that time. I had a part-time university job, and I decided to tell people in advance that this was what was happening, and I took my period of leave, and then I came back, and they were very supportive. I mean, more than supportive, interested. Most had never heard of it. Was the first ordination in Western Europe that had happened.
You're a bit of a pioneer, aren't you?
I never thought about that before, actually. But yeah, interesting. Yes. So they were very supportive. There was humour as well. There was a lot of humour. I remember one elderly colleague who I work with, love him dearly, came up to me and said, "Barbara, you've turned into a lesbian."
Well, interesting.
It was interesting, and to which I said, "So what?" So yes, it was a good thing to do, and felt very important for me. Yeah.
It makes me think of another thing you mentioned to us during the last 2 days, is that you are happiest at intersections and out on edges. And I'm intrigued about how your ordination and your meditation links with the work with the Centre for Courage and Renewal. It seems that there should be an interesting intersection there. Do you find that?
Yeah, that's also a really interesting question. So for me personally, I find the two support each other well. But I have had the experience of being in retreats, courage retreats. So we offer a lot of public retreats where, because we work in partnership some of the time with a mindfulness training organisation, occasionally we have mindfulness trained people come along and participate in the retreats. And I recall in the early retreats that there was some fascination that after working in the circle for a short time, people were dropping into what one might call a kind of contemplative meditative space, but of course without doing meditation. And I think this was really interesting to people who had a mindfulness training, because of course the assumption is it's meditation that gets us to that place. But actually there's a really interesting academic in this field who has written extensively about something called implicational working memory. And the implicational working memory is the kind of memory that allows us to, if we see an accident in the street, the mind kind of, rattles and the cogs go round and we cross the road to help the person. So the implicational bit is us making sense of what's happened and then we cross the road. So it's things like empathy and care, all of these things. And he's argued really strongly that the things that help us expand the terrain of our implicational working memory are, yes, meditation. So of course that's important to the mindfulness field, but also poetry, music, art, which of course is what we use in Courage and Renewal. So it's another way of beginning to access this kind of brain state, if you like, that we can work with.
I find it so fascinating because in my own little book that I wrote about beyond certification and working in the natural resources sphere, at the end I share the stories about how poetry and music and art is so important, and quoted a few cases where we'd done that and that had led to companies who are involved in natural resource exploitation, often campaigned against by NGOs, having a real deep thoughtful process around how they were operating, and it led to major changes. And when we talked to them, it wasn't the poetry and the art or the music that turned them on its own, but they all say that it was an important part of the equation. It helped them to look at the problem in a different way. And I'm hearing that in what you're saying, that it just brings more to us, to the decision, as opposed to just, what's the bottom line on this decision? We actually start thinking about it more as a whole person. It seems to be what you're saying.
Yes, I mean, the way that I make sense of that is it kind of puts space around the issue that we're dealing with. So, and there would be lots of ways, I guess, of understanding what that gives you. I mean, from wriggle room to perspective to, rather than us having this very kind of tight, what do I do now with this problem? How do I fix it? How do I get somebody to do this? So that, it's like flicking a switch, isn't it? I can get this to happen, I can flick the switch. We're not in the switch flicking business here with Courage Work. What we are in the business of is seeing the place of what is presenting itself to us in the wider landscape. So it's something about perspective. If we can widen our perspective, and if we can also reduce the charge that what we're looking at has for us. So there's something about seeing what we're seeing in a wider perspective that means it's less charged. So the metaphor I have for that is, if you put a pinch of salt in a glass of water and drink the water, you'll taste the salt. But if you put a pinch of salt into a bucket of water and drink the water, you're unlikely to taste it. So it's that kind of change of charge that we get by having this wider perspective, I think.
I think you're right. And the other aspect of that is the slowing down process. There was a big slowing down, and that gave us time to really look at the problems in a calmer way and look at the dilemmas in a calmer way. I think that's an important part of the work as well. Well, we're mindful of the time, and Barbara's got to go and catch a plane, so we need to wrap it up. But last question, Barbara. Nick Ross was here. We're going to talk to Nick at some point on a TFT Earthworm podcast too. Nick is in training to become a second facilitator. What do you think the future holds for the work that you're doing with the Courage and Renewal Centre here in Europe, the Centre for Courage and Renewal here in Europe, to bring these circles of trust more broadly? Do you think you're going to be flat out busy for the years ahead? I think you will be.
Well, I certainly hope so. At the moment, we've really only brought the weekend retreats to Europe, so The Courage to Lead program that we've just done is a kind of classic weekend model retreat. There are other programs that it would be lovely to be able to explore. And yeah, I'm looking forward to a growing community and hopefully the prospect of being able to train a cohort of facilitators here in Europe, maybe in a couple of years.
Well, that's a great discussion, and after a great couple of days with pioneer Barbara Reid, she laughs when I say that. But you clearly are out there, Barbara, doing really interesting work, and we're very grateful for your time here with us in Switzerland, and we're looking forward to keeping track of what you're up to in the months and years ahead. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.